Welcome back to my channel for a short Hasselblad X2D episode. So this is the newest medium format, I should say crop medium format camera system from Hasselblad, the X2D and the new XCD lenses. So here currently mounted is the 38mm lens. And if you look at that lens camera combo here, it's quite compact, it's non-intrusive, so I think it should be perfect for street photography, and that's what this video is all about. Let's kick it off. Let's take a step back and let's think for a moment about street photography. What is street photography all about? It's about walking the streets, being somewhere on the move and taking images of what's happening at that particular time, in that particular moment. And there are many requirements you might want to impose on a good camera lens combo for street photography. And many people will say, I need speedy autofocus. And here I can say the Hasselblad X2D with the new face detection algorithms implemented has a much more speedy autofocus than what we had before, for instance, on the X1D Mark II, but it's still not at par, of course, with a Sony camera or a Canon or Nikon camera. The second aspect you might want to consider when it comes to street photography is the compactness factor of the camera lens combination. And here on the Hasselblad X2D with that 38mm lens, you have actually a non-intrusive camera in your hands and you will not catch too much attention if you walk down the streets in the neighborhood, you know, where people might even look at you and don't know you or recognize you, and you take photos. So this is clearly from a form perspective, a suitable camera and a suitable lens for street photography. One of my most favorite cameras for street photography is actually the Leica Q2. And here's the Leica Q2 in the 007 limited special edition. I just shot this camera intensely over the summer period on Sardinia Island in Italy. And this is clearly even more compact than what we have on the X2D here with that lens. So it's smaller, it's even less intrusive, and it also has fantastic image quality. Also here we have on the Leica side here a full frame sensor, and here we have a larger sensor or crop medium format sensor with 44 x 33mm. But there are more parallels between these two camera systems. And one of the parallels is that the focal length here is almost the same. So on the Leica Q2, we have a 28mm lens. Let's quickly open this up. We have here a Summilux, widest open 1 to 1.7 and 28mm. And if we look at the Hasselblad combo here, we have a 38mm lens. And that 38mm lens in full frame equivalent terms, if we apply a crop factor of 0.79, boils down to give or take a 30mm lens. So we have a 30mm full frame perspective or field of view here and a 28mm full frame perspective on the Leica Q2, which is quite comparable. And that focal length, 28mm, let's say 30mm, that is a really good focal length for street photography, and many people appreciate that special look, that special field of view you have when you shoot with a 28mm lens on a full frame sensor or a 38mm lens on a 44 x 33mm sensor like we have it in the Hasselblad X2D. Staying in the full frame sensor camp, you can go even smaller with a full frame camera for street photography. And that here is, for instance, the Sony RX1R Mark II, and is an even more compact camera than the Leica Q2 if we compare this. And this camera has a full frame sensor, an excellent sensor, high resolution from Sony, and also has on the focus side a lot to offer, much more actually than what the Hasselblad X2D has. And as I said, it is even more compact. So here's another choice you could go for. And then when we spoke in our first aspect about speedy autofocus, you can also do street photography without any autofocus at all. And many people love to walk down the streets with Leica rangefinder camera. So here's a Leica M10P with, again, a 28mm lens, which I think is a very good focal length for street photography. And that camera has no autofocus at all, but you can do range or zone focusing, and in this way also be very quick in taking a shot. And then the last one I wanted to mention is leaving the full frame sensor camp. So here, for instance, we have the Nikon CFC, that's an APS-C sensor, or in a recent video which I posted on my channel, I took actually the Leica D-Lux 7 here in a limited special edition, and that becomes even smaller than the Sony RX1R Mark II. So there are lots of variations you can go for in this particular video, and I wanted to have this preamble here on street photography in general. We do this with the Hasselblad X2D. I will record my shooting, we'll look into images, and I think that we have here a lot to offer for street photography, because with a 100 megapixel sensor like we have it in the Hasselblad X2D, you also have later in post lots of options to crop in and change the perspective and the field of view, maybe to a different aspect you captured in a 100 megapixel frame. And I've shown in my intro video on the Hasselblad X2D that the autofocus massively improved. And that was one of my big complaints on the Hasselblad X1D Mark II, that autofocus was not quick. Here now we have face detection and it works reasonably quick, reasonably well. And you can shoot this lens stop down. You can also shoot it widest open at f2.5. It will always find focus much quicker than what we had on previous Hasselblad X system cameras. So quite nice. And if you care about autofocus in your photography, then this might be an option. Clearly, if you are a rangefinder shooter for street photography, like here for instance with a Leica M10P, you can also manually focus here and just lift up the focus ring, then you get a distance scale. And if you are used to taking manual focus shots in street photography, this camera might be even more interesting for you, because we have now this distance scale and we can do this in the same precise way in terms of focusing as we can do it on Leica rangefinder cameras. Location and time I chose for my street photography with the X2D and the XCD 38mm was an early Saturday morning. And I love this particular time of the day because the streets are still empty. So the city is kind of abundant from people, and you will only see a few people already on their way or building up, you know, a marketplace outside, what have you. But it is a beautiful time to walk down the streets in a city with your camera. And that's what I'm going to do now. I will show a clip about my shooting, and then we'll look into sample images, and then I will conclude the video. The quality of the images from that Saturday morning exceeded my expectations. And in terms of shooting parameters, I think most of the images I took with an aperture of f5.6, which with a 38mm lens on the Hasselblad sensor is good for street. And I was in aperture priority mode, so the shutter speed was figured out by the camera, and I also switched to auto ISO, which is possible on the X2D in aperture priority and shutter priority mode, but not in fully manual mode. And here for this frame, the camera decided for an ISO of 3200, and the image looks just fine. You know, if you go into dark areas in the frames, you might see a little bit of grain here, but that can be hexed away in post. And in general, it's a nice image, and also the lights here and the colors based on Hasselblad's natural color science come across very nicely. Here another frame, and here the camera decided for the double ISO 6400. And if you look at that sign, for instance, here, cropping in by 100%, it looks still really clean. So you can safely use that new sensor in the same way as you could do it on the X1D Mark II, up to 6.4K on the ISO side. And the difference is that here on the X2D, you can do this with even the double resolution of 100 megapixel compared to 50 megapixel. Also here the windows, quite nice, hardly any noise, a little bit of fine grain in darker areas like here in that window, but in general a really good result. Also in terms of that red lighting here in the window, it looks fine. It is a really good image quality what we find here on that new 100 megapixel sensor. Here an image from the marketplace, which you saw quickly in the video clip I played before, and at an aperture of f5.6 you already see here some light bursts from the lights on that marketplace, quite nice. Here the vegetables you could purchase, ISO 3200, cropping in by 100%. Here was the focus sitting, absolutely clean and clear. No issues with higher ISO values when shooting with that new Hasselblad sensor. Here an image at 1600 and then the grain is completely gone. It looks really clean, that image here. And you have this immense sharpness which that new sensor is delivering. Here empty streets, empty places, women walking down the street. Since I was in aperture priority mode and had stopped down to f5.6, the camera knows that it has in-body image stabilization, so you might get in aperture priority mode a slower shutter speed. And here the camera decided for 1/40 seconds, and that was not fast enough to get that lady here walking down the street pinpoint sharp, so there is some fuzziness from movements. But all the rest of the image is super sharp and super crisp and looks really, really good. Here another image at 1600, again, empty places, empty streets. And then here finally, sometime later in the morning, the light was strong enough and the camera gave me an ISO of 100 in auto ISO mode here. And then you get all the sharpness and crispness here in these images. I also cut this down to a 16:9 format to reduce a little bit the foreground here on the waterfront on River Limmat in Zurich. And then I like sometimes these scenes which occur to you by chance. And here on this empty place, there was this guy standing and just smoking his pipe. So this is an ISO of 800 here now. And the guy was not getting distracted by me being there with my camera. Maybe he didn't notice, maybe he didn't want to notice. And I was able to capture that image, which I like a lot. A guy smoking a pipe early morning. And then I crossed one of the main bridges here towards this church, and this church is called the Frauenmünster. It's a very famous church with Marc Chagall windows inside, so quite nice from an art perspective. And then the camera went finally to the base ISO of 64, and then you get the optimum image quality here. That is really the best you can get in terms of sharpness. Absolutely brilliant, nothing to complain. It's an amazing level of detail, as I mentioned several times in other videos on the X2D on my channel, which you get out of this new Hasselblad sensor. Very nice. Empty places, empty streets. I think it's time to conclude the video. The conclusion of what you just saw in terms of shooting and sample images is pretty straightforward. The X2D with the 38mm lens is a fantastic combo for street photography. It's non-intrusive, you get high image quality, you have huge reserves for cropping in terms of resolution. Autofocus is working reasonably well now with face detection, but you can also go for manual focus, as I mentioned previously in the video, and do sonar range focusing here. And the grip of the camera, the build quality, the weather resistance, all in. It's highly capable for street photography, but in general also for travel photography, reportage photography, and what have you. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.